Who was the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher at Hogwarts before Quirrell? How many teachers have held that position since it was cursed by Voldemort? And what happened to each of those teachers? That's what we're going to find out in today's episode of The Leaky Cauldron. Hey there, wizards! How's it going? Defense Against the Dark Arts was a required subject in the Hogwarts curriculum since the very first school year, and the position of professor wasn't always cursed. After all, the school has existed for over 1,000 years. So, many teachers have held this and other positions. Among the notable names who held the position of Defense Against the Dark Arts professor are Isidora Morganac, who was a witch that lived around 1470 to 1500, and she manifested magic late. At the age of 15, Isidora was sensitive to ancient magic, which allowed her to see traces of that magic, and she used it in ways that other witches and wizards could not. She belonged to Ravenclaw House while she was a student, and it didn't take long after she graduated for her to become an apprentice and, later, a professor. The problem with Isidora was that she started using ancient magic to remove people's pain and trauma. Even though she had good intentions behind it, she didn't realize that pain and suffering were part of people's learning process, that this was fundamental to making people stronger. It was part of being human. Things started to get out of control, and Isidora turned against her mentors at Hogwarts and ended up being killed by one of them, who was Professor Sanbakar, who taught the equivalent of care of magical creatures at the time. This character doesn't appear in the Harry Potter books, but rather in the game Hogwarts Legacy.
Dina Rickett was also a Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher at Hogwarts, and is also a character from the game Hogwarts Legacy.
And she taught that subject between the years 1890 and 1991, and it's not known how long she held that position. But at that time, the position wasn't cursed at all. She also belonged to Ravenclaw House when she was a student at Hogwarts. And before becoming a teacher, she worked as an unspeakable in the Department of Mysteries. We don't know how long this character held the position of teacher, but it was very common for teachers to stay at Hogwarts for decades and decades. For a period, Albus Dumbledore also taught Defense Against the Dark Arts, at least between 1910 and 1927.
We don't know if he was a permanent teacher of this subject or if he was just substituting for some teachers.
But, according to the story presented in Fantastic Beasts: The Crimes of Grindelwald, Dumbledore was forbidden to teach Defense Against the Dark Arts. He refused to help the Ministry of Magic at the time to capture Grindelwald, to fight against Grindelwald.
So the head of magical law enforcement at the time, Thorkel Travers, forbade him from teaching Defense Against the Dark Arts.
This is information that's in the movie Fantastic Beasts: The Crimes of Grindelwald, but it ends up conflicting with the information we have in the books. Because at the time when Dumbledore is shown teaching Defense Against the Dark Arts, it was actually another teacher who held the position. And also because it was always mentioned in the books that Dumbledore was a Transfiguration teacher. But in Fantastic Beasts, he's teaching Defense Against the Dark Arts. Could it be that he taught both subjects? It's possible. We're talking about Dumbledore. Could it be that he was just substituting for another teacher? That could be the case too. That wasn't made clear, but the teacher in question who taught Defense Against the Dark Arts during that period was Galatea Meritoth, and she held that position for over 50 years. And according to the information in the books, she retired around 1945, which is when Tom Riddle graduated from Hogwarts.
If she taught for 50 years, then she started teaching at Hogwarts around 1895, and she was one of the last teachers to hold the position before it was actually cursed.
In 1945, when Tom Riddle graduated from Hogwarts, he went to ask for the job from Armando Dippet, who was the headmaster at the time. But Dippet denied him the position because Tom Riddle was too young, and he advised him to come back in a few years. And then, someone else was hired to fill that position, which was vacant due to Professor Galatea Meritoth's retirement. And we don't know who it was. Almost 20 years later, Tom Riddle comes back to Hogwarts, now with Dumbledore as headmaster, to ask for the job.
But not because he really wanted to be a teacher.
But he wanted to be inside Hogwarts because it would be easier to shape the students' minds there to follow his ideology, to make them believe in him, and it would be easier to recruit these kids to his side. But obviously Dumbledore already knew about the things he was doing, already knew how he was known, not as Tom Riddle anymore, but as Voldemort, and denies him this position. And so it's in this meeting around 1965 that the position is cursed by Voldemort. From that year on, no defense against the dark arts teacher stayed in the position for more than a single school year. So if we stop to count, from 1966 until 1998, which is when Voldemort is defeated and the curse is broken, there were about 32 defense against the dark arts teachers at Hogwarts. Who each of them was is where you might be disappointed, because we don't know most of them. But we do know at least 2 names before Quirrell. From 1966 to 1988, we don't know who the teachers were that held this position or what happened to them. But in the school year of 1988, the defense against the dark arts teacher was Patricia Hochbeck. She was a Hogwarts student who belonged to Gryffindor House, and before becoming the defense against the dark arts teacher, she worked as a curse breaker for Gringotts Bank, the same position that Bill Weasley held. Although she was a talented witch, she was not who she seemed to be, and was part of a kind of secret organization. In addition, she was directly responsible for the death of a student, and tried to manipulate other students to uncover secrets buried at Hogwarts. However, she was discovered, forced to leave Hogwarts, and was sent to Azkaban. This character appears in the game Hogwarts Mystery.
In the school year of 1989 to 1990, the person who held the position left the school in the middle of the night without giving a reason, and we don't know who it is.
After that, in the school year of 1990 to 1991, the person who held the position was a witch named Olivia Green. She was from Ravenclaw House as a student, and she was also an unspeakable at the Ministry of Magic. She accepted the position after being called by Dumbledore, after the previous professor simply left the school. Olivia was quite talented, but she ended up leaving the position because several of her memories were altered, making her believe in things that, in reality, happened in a completely different way. After regaining her true memories, she resigned without saying anything and returned to the Ministry of Magic. She also appears in the game Hogwarts Mystery.
It was then, at the beginning of the 1991 school year, that Quirrell, who previously taught Muggle studies but had taken a sabbatical year, ended up returning to the school,
and he accepted the defense against the dark arts position. There was just a little problem with Quirrell, right? He didn't come back the same person after that sabbatical year because he was simply serving Lord Voldemort. And during the school year, he tried several times to kill Harry Potter, who was in his first year. And in the attempt to steal the Sorcerer's Stone, after becoming a sort of host for Voldemort's soul, he ended up dying.
In the following school year, in 1992 and 1993, the one who took this position was Gilderoy Lockhart, the famous Gilderoy Lockhart, who was actually a fraud and whom Dumbledore hired with the intention of exposing him.
That's because Dumbledore knew wizards whose stories Gilderoy had stolen and whose memories he had altered. And according to Dumbledore himself, there's a lot to learn, even from a teacher like Gilderoy Lockhart. And wasn't it actually pretty dangerous in the end? Because he almost erased the memories of Harry and Ron. But thanks to a broken wand, the spell backfired on Gilderoy Lockhart, and he himself was affected by the spell he cast. And to this day, he hasn't recovered his memory, living in St. Mungo's Hospital, in the ward for neurological injuries. That year, when Gilderoy accepted the position, it was already very difficult to find someone to teach defense against the dark arts, because the rumor that the position was cursed spread, especially with the recurring dismissal of several teachers over the course of 30 years. But then Gilderoy ended up accepting, because he could simply shine while teaching defense against the dark arts to Harry Potter or something like that. And then, in the following school year, 1993 and 1994, Hogwarts finally has the best defense against the dark arts teacher, which is Remus Lupin. Dumbledore convinced Lupin to join the faculty by offering him unlimited access to the stock of Wolfsbane potion. A lot of people look and say, wow, Dumbledore hired a werewolf, right? That's crazy. But he offered this potion, this unlimited access to the potion, which made Lupin transform into a wolf, but he remained conscious. That way, he wasn't a danger.
What happens is that at the end of the year, he forgets to take the potion because of everything that's going on, and he simply ends up becoming dangerous.
Snape ends up revealing out of spite to the Slytherin students that Lupin was a werewolf. He kept trying, throughout the school year, to get them to find out, asking for essays on the subject and so on. But after Dumbledore, to defend Lupin, said that he helped Harry and Hermione against Sirius Black, Snape couldn't stand it and told the Slytherin students that Lupin was a werewolf. And that made him resign. He didn't want to stay at the school. Actually, that final scene in Prisoner of Azkaban, for me, is really sad. With Lupin leaving the school, packing his things, it gives me a feeling of emptiness. In the following school year, from 1994 to 1995, another defense against the dark arts teacher, although crazy and a disguised murderer, taught some really cool things to the students. Barty Crouch Jr. disguised as Mad-Eye Moody, the most famous Auror of all time, ended up infiltrating Hogwarts, manipulating the Triwizard Tournament.
So that Harry would fall into a trap and go to a cemetery in Little Hangleton so that Voldemort could return to his human form.
This plan worked. Dumbledore was fooled, the whole school was fooled, and in the end, the real Alastor Moody was locked in a trunk. Bartemius Crouch Jr. was revealed, suffered the Dementor's kiss which should never have happened, but Minister Cornelius Fudge insisted on being a fool, and so, once again, the position of defense against the dark arts teacher was vacant. And that's when, unlike previous years, in the following school year, it's the Ministry of Magic who, in the dead of night, passes a law saying that if Dumbledore couldn't find a teacher, the Ministry would do it. So the Ministry appoints Dolores Umbridge as the defense against the dark arts teacher. She tries to completely change the way the subject is taught, making it all theoretical because she's afraid the students are forming an army to take over the Ministry of Magic along with Dumbledore. And a campaign of repression by the Ministry of Magic at Hogwarts starts there in full force.
Umbridge not only didn't teach anything, but also tortured the students with very sadistic methods to maintain order, discipline, and the Ministry of Magic's version of the truth.
She also ends up becoming the High Inquisitor of Hogwarts. But at the end of that school year, she ends up being taken by centaurs in the Forbidden Forest, then rescued by Dumbledore, and ends up being fired. And that's when, in the following school year, from 1996 to 1997, Severus Snape, who was crazy about that position, finally gets to teach that subject. As a teacher, he was extremely strict, just like he was in potions, but he was highly competent. He also acted as an agent, and at the end of the school year, after he murdered Dumbledore, he had to leave the school, so he ends up leaving the position. But one very interesting thing about Snape finally taking the position of defense against the dark arts, it's that Dumbledore denied him this position for all those years, with the excuse that Snape wouldn't relapse to his old ways, or as a Death Eater. But in my opinion, that's nothing more than a big lie from Dumbledore. He knew the position was cursed, so he just wanted to keep Snape close. He knew that any professor in that position wouldn't last more than one school year, and exactly in the year he knows he's going to die, and plans out his own death with Snape as the killer, he gives the position to him. Of course, Dumbledore knew that the curse meant the person wouldn't stay in the position. He didn't want something catastrophic to happen to that person. It happened to Quirrell. He ended up dying because he was a servant of Voldemort, and Voldemort left him there agonizing. Gilderoy, he tried to erase the memory of 2 children, so the spell backfired on him because the wand was broken. But Lupin just resigned. Alright, Bartemius Crouch Jr. suffered the Dementor's kiss. But I don't believe that happened because he held the position of professor.
He had already been discovered, and he was going to be sent to Azkaban. He simply wasn't going to stay because he was found out as an imposter.
So, something catastrophic wouldn't necessarily happen to the person who held the position. They just wouldn't actually stay in the position. In the following school year, when Hogwarts was under Voldemort's regime, the position of defense against the dark arts teacher became just dark arts. But even so, it still carried a curse. The person who took the position of teacher was Amicus Carrow, who was one of the Death Eaters, and who taught unforgivable curses to the students, making them practice on first-year students. Anyway, Amicus was extremely cruel and sadistic, but he ended up leaving the position because that year the Battle of Hogwarts happened. and the Death Eaters who weren't killed were imprisoned. In the Battle of Hogwarts, after Voldemort is killed, the curse on the position ends up being lifted. But we don't know. There's no information about who takes over the position of Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher after that. We know that Harry goes back to Hogwarts, not to study, but he gives some Defense Against the Dark Arts lectures, but he doesn't become a teacher. He definitely doesn't become a teacher.
And then we have information from the year 2008 about a teacher who takes the position, whose name is Kate Brindlemore.
She appears as a Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher in content from Harry Potter games, and she is portrayed as a very competent, very firm, very strict teacher, and who finally remained in the position for more than one school year. She taught from 2008 to 2011, but information about her is quite scarce. Anyway, these are the details we have about Defense Against the Dark Arts teachers at Hogwarts. Before Harry's school year began, the information is very fragmented. We have practically nothing about the teachers who held these positions during all those years, ever since it was cursed. And some other information, the little information we have there, 2 years before Harry's school year began, comes from games, and the later period also comes from games. That is, it comes from the expanded Harry Potter universe. Games, Fantastic Beasts, they don't come directly from the books. Personally, I consider all of it as part of the Harry Potter universe. Even the Cursed Child, which goes totally against the established universe. The author said it's canon, so it's canon. There's not much we can do about it, you know? To be honest, I ignore some things myself. I just take the information I think is really cool, like Hermione being Minister of Magic, stuff like that. But hopefully, I don't know, right? Maybe in the series this will be shown in some way? It would be more developed if we at least got flashes of previous professors and, I don't know, found out information later, like who was the professor right after that. It would be really cool.
But that's it. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Comment down below if you'd like to see more about the Defense Against the Dark Arts professors, because, come on, imagine, they'd have to come up with a bunch of characters to fill the position. It would be really cool.
And come up with several creative endings so they don't stay in the position, right? That would be really cool to see. If you like this episode, leave a like and a comment and share if you want. And I'll see you in the next episode of The Leaky Cauldron. Until then, mischief managed.